So let's begin with the frontispiece to a book that remains profoundly important for architects. In fact, all architects should read it. And also important in terms of architecture's relationship to language, because in fact, it defined the literary genre of the utopian novel. I'm talking about Sir Thomas More's Utopia. More was a jurist, and he also had a diplomatic career. He became an envoy to Flanders. And in 1516, he published in Latin a novel simply called Utopia. It saw a second edition in 1518 and then began to be translated, which is a testimony to its immense success in the 16th century. What is crucial about this book, and what I mean to say when I say that it defined the genre of utopian writing, was its literary, or is its literary structure. It is essentially a binary structure. It is divided into two parts. The first unfolds as a conversation which ultimately ends up as a critique of contemporary society and of kingship as a model of governance, as a kind of model for the state, and as a principle, as a political principle. The second part, we encounter there a traveler who describes the island of Utopia that he's visited. In other words, what is happening because of this binary structure is the idea that a criticism of the real is embedded in the imagining of an ideal, of a utopia. So utopia is not simply a word that evokes a kind of social fiction or a kind of delusion. Instead, key to the idea of utopia, whether it's in a novel or whether it appears in architecture, as with Ledoux, is that it always stems from a critique of current social conditions. Embedded in the principle of utopia is a critical intentionality. We also want to add to this the fact that the word utopia etymologically has two meanings. It stems from the Greek, and it can mean no place or happy place, which is a kind of fascinating collision, a collision underscoring that utopia is necessarily unrealizable, but that it establishes conditions of possibility, whether they are architectural or whether they are in terms of social, legal, or political policy. To look back at the woodcuts that functioned as a frontispiece for the novel, we can see that it actually responded to the literary trope that More was unfurling in the novel. If you look at the title, you'll see that essentially it is called the figure of the island of Utopia, meaning that utopia here finds its figure in the island. What does this mean? It means that it is somewhere else. It is only accessible by ship. It is only part of, or the outcome of, a voyage of discovery. If you also look more closely, though, you'll see that the island slowly morphs into the figure of a skull. In other words, it is a memento mori. It is the image of death in Arcadia, if you will, a way to say that utopia has never happened and can never happen, but we can dream of the possibilities it offers. Now, in addition to this literary tradition, or this relationship, as it were, to language, we also have a very specific lineage that is more relevant, directly relevant to architecture, in other words, a visual tradition. We can go back to the classical world, in fact, and look at the architectural treatise of Vitruvius. Vitruvius was a Roman architect and engineer from the 1st century BC. And in his treatise, which is actually still today really the most complete classical treatise we have on architecture, we will find a section devoted to the ideal city, or to city planning, as it were. What's important for us is that this treatise was, as it were, rediscovered during the Renaissance. The curious part of this is that the illustrations, the original illustrations in the classical text were lost. So what Renaissance architects did, in fact, was represent the ideas that they found in the text. They drew from the language of the text to imagine in diagrammatic form, in terms of visual representation, what the text was saying about the ideal city. So if we look at a 1511 edition with illustrations added in by the Renaissance author, we see here a Renaissance version of Vitruvian ideas. What's very clear from the text and the images that were inserted is that Vitruvius seems to have put aside practical issues when he dealt with town planning. Instead, the diagram shows us an ideal form enclosed by a protective wall, like a kind of military fort. Think forward to Ledoux's ramparts, with reinforced towers for strategic purposes. This is a radial arrangement. It's a radial arrangement that will affect the image of the city throughout the Renaissance and be carried over into the Enlightenment. It's also a very specific kind of radial arrangement. It is essentially octagonal. It's based on the 8 directions of the prevailing winds, which are avoided, Vitruvius tells us, for hygienic purposes by 8 streets that bisect them. Here, in other words, the octagon, the notion of the 8-sided city, emerges as an ideal geometry for the contour of the urban fabric. Which brings us really to this example, which is the very first ideal city conceived in the Renaissance. It's called Sforzinda, the town of Sforzinda. What we have here is a plan that's not based on any actual surroundings, any real surroundings, but rather made to obey those principles of harmony, of regularity, and of enclosure whose seeds were found in Vitruvius's text. In other words, you could argue that this is not exactly a utopia, but rather a formal pattern. We can see Vitruvian principles being extended and imagined in the Italian Renaissance, with the military fortress of the ancients still the dominant metaphor for urban planning.